by some fatal malady, then the world would have become
Ormazd was the
Mithraic.
being of light, and Ahrimanes the being of darkness. Standing between them, Mithras
Give the name
is
Mithras
the mediator.
and celebrate his rites in secret caves, that shrouded in the dim obscurity of the darkness they may shun the touch of the pure and glorious light. Truly an illumined exaltation of a deity, a hateful recognition of a barbarian rite.
Mithras, Lord of Light, please help me, Father of our fathers.
Around the 1st century AD, a series of cult temples began to spring up across the Roman Empire, dedicated to a god called Mithras. There were other cults in the Roman Empire, such as those dedicated to Isis, the mother of the earth, or to the Eleusinian Mysteries, a seasonal religion that celebrated the soul's immortality. Yet of Mithras we know virtually nothing. Many statues and monuments have survived, including 3 temple sites in the British Isles. But the cult disappeared 200 years after appearing, which coincided with the growth of Christianity. There exist no texts, no liturgies of the Mithras to tell us what rites and rituals they practiced. The initiates kept Mithras' secrets across the ages. Probably because of this lack of knowledge and of Mithras' designation as a mystery religion, countless internet sites and books have proposed that Mithras was Christ in all but name. Was Mithras born to a virgin on the 25th of December? Was he attended by 12 figures? And through his worship, could man achieve salvation?
Mitra is the Persian name of an ancient Indo-European deity, which have its roots to about 2000 BC to Persia and India. So in the Indian text, he's known as Mitra Varuna, and in Zoroastrian text, he's known as Mitra. And later on, we see Mithras in the Greek-Roman world, which is a combination of Mitra, but also Greek-Roman culture itself. So Mitra and Mithras are not identical, but they are related, and one is evolution of the other one, or better to use the word syncretic religion rather than an original religion of the Middle East in that sense.
Mithras emerged onto the scholarly landscape at the end of the 19th century. And the man who was most responsible was a guy called Frans Cumont. And he was a Belgian speaking to very often Catholic audiences. And what he did in looking at the Mithras cult was to try to accredit that cult and give it a real religious value and make it oh so Christian, really. Now, one of the other things he did to it was to say, this is a Persian god, it must have Persian origins. And he went to town on that. He did everything he could to find genuine connections between the Mithras cult as we have it and the scriptures, the Pahlavi scriptures, the Middle Persian scriptures, and to try and find some trace of this religion.
Yes, the Persian Empire was the largest and most potent enemy of Rome, but the Roman and the Persian empires faced each other in what is now the Middle East, which had been civilized and settled for millennia before Rome or Persia were thought of. And the cities and peoples there had relationships, they kept trading and intermarrying and so on across the political borders. So it was not at all difficult for religions to move from the sphere of one empire to another. Equally, Judaism and Christianity both crossed from what was Roman territory into Persian territory. So, you know, there wasn't an iron curtain between the two empires.
It's obvious that Mithras is a Persian god. That's where the name comes from. But the Greeks and the Romans have a nasty habit of making gods their own. They did the same thing with Isis and Osiris when they took them on board in a sort of parallel cult. And it is very doubtful whether there is very much that is genuinely Persian about Mithras apart from his name. The centres of worship aren't in Persia. They aren't on the borders of Persia. They don't thin out the further you get from Persia. They have a Roman distribution, and one of the worst things about it is that the centre of distribution appears to be Rome itself.
If this cult took its name and background from another culture, as did the other Roman cults of Isis and Demeter, what makes Mithraism stand out amongst them?
It's different, I think, from other cults in that it appears to be newly created in the 1st century AD out of various elements. So it doesn't have a long tradition before it springs up and spreads. It's born out of a combination of astrology, the sort of bringing in of the names of certain Persian gods. It seems to be more, as it were, intellectual in its creation than perhaps other cults. There are various theories about the origins and spread of Mithraism. One view, which I think has got quite a lot going for it, is that it emerges in Anatolia, in the kingdom of Commagene, which was a subject state within the Roman Empire. The kings of Commagene built an amazing complex for ruler cult at Nemrut Dag in Turkey, which is still a tourist site. They certainly were interested in astrology, and there are astrological reliefs, depictions of events, astrological events at Nemrut Dag. And the court at Commagene included within it a number of astrologers who then moved to the Roman imperial court. And probably in the 1st century AD, people from Commagene came to Rome and spread this cult.
You can go anywhere almost in Europe and find a Mithraeum, except Greece. It was more traditional. So all over the place you have the remains of buildings, the remains of sculptures, above all, some paintings, always depicting the same sorts of scenes, the same sorts of mythology. So it's a very tempting set of remains that the Mithras cult has left behind. It's left behind a set of puzzles for us to decode.
In Homer's Odyssey, Homer describes a cave of the nymphs where Odysseus is washed up ashore at the end of his adventures. And writers writing in the 3rd century AD, in particular Porphyry, writes a discussion of this in which he interprets it allegorically, and in the process of doing that compares it with a Mithraeum. And this leads us to be able to make assumptions about what was normal in a Mithraeum.
There are other temples of other cults which are quite similar, but temples of Mithras tend to have raised benches down each side on which the devotees sat, which is not something that one finds in other types of temple.
Most of Mithraea, I think, would be built, but often built sunk into the ground to give them at least a semi-subterranean feel. A lot of surviving Mithraea are 10 to 20 meters in length and about 5 to 8 meters wide. That's a very, very crude indication. They tend to have a standard form. They often have an apse at the end with the tauroctony, the cult image, in front of that.
Of course, they didn't call them Mithraea. What they called them was the cave, you know. So presumably they'd say to their friends, "I'm going down the cave tonight." And what did they do in those caves? Well, of course, the Christian authors have things to say about these wicked Mithraists, and it's a bit like listening to a politician of one party talking about politicians of another party.
Our problem with knowing what went on at temples of Mithras is that no texts relating to the rituals have survived.
The forces of life and nature. Mithras is the god of light and truth.
At the Great North Museum in Newcastle, a large video installation recreates how Mithraeum could have operated. Using the dimensions of the excavated temple from Hadrian's Wall nearby, the museum uses Franz Cumont's thesis of a Christianized Mithras.
In our initiation ceremonies. I cannot divulge details of our ceremonies, except to say that they involve ordeals of heat.
We can construct a certain amount about the ritual. Archaeological remains show that feasting played an important part. We do find animal remains, which suggests that meeting together and eating together within the Mithraeum was a fairly standard practice.
Now we know they did share a meal with each other. We see pictures of people reclining, because ancients obviously reclined on couches to eat from very low tables. They were served, presumably they were served by lower members of the grade, by ravens, who were sort of the neophytes, if you like, those that had just entered the religion. And it would have to be by people who were lowly in the grade structure rather than by a separate class of servers, because they couldn't enter the place without being initiated.
There's a famous, or there is an important vase from Mainz in Germany which depicts a couple of rituals, one involving a man shooting an arrow towards another person and towards a rock behind him. A second image on the other side of the vase showing a procession. So we assume that there were processions. We assume that there were initiation rituals. Again, a further Mithraeum in southern Italy has rather faded frescoes depicting what appear to be initiation rituals involving a sword, involving blindfold, involving the initiate lying down on the ground. So we can reconstruct these. I think that use of light and darkness would have been a very significant part in a lot of Mithraea. We have a number of tauroctonies with holes drilled in them, which suggest that lights would be put behind them. How bright you could make a light in a cave using the technology then available is, I think, not entirely clear. But if it is very gloomy, if ritual is happening at night, then I think you could certainly have a fairly noticeable effect by sudden introduction of light, sudden disappearance of light. And although it's more difficult to find evidence for sound, I think it would be a safe assumption that similar things would be done with noise. I think there would be an interest in creating powerful sensory imagery, possibly sensory overload in various ways. There are fragments of a narrative about Mithras. His life can only be sort of crudely reconstructed. We have images, we have no Mithraic texts, we have no texts which actually describe what Mithraic activity was about. We only have images.
Just as in a Christian church, the focus is the cross. And the cross carries the symbolism of the religion, the single most important thing there is to know about Christianity is enshrined in that image of the cross. So, in the case of the Mithras religion, the focal point was the act of Mithras killing the bull, which we know from the Greek words for this as tauroktoni, bull killing, tauroktoni. It's always in the same posture, with him putting the dagger or sword down into the bull, and you can see the wound, and underneath you will find a dog, a crater, that's just a mixing bowl, a serpent, a crab, and a scorpion. And all these attributes, these seemingly miscellaneous features, are constant. They've got to be there. In a full tauroctony, that's what you get. And of course the $64,000 question is, why? And sometimes these tauroctonies will be more of a relief than a freestanding sculpture, and you will have Mithras killing the bull in a rocky cave. And of course you're meeting in the cave, and we know from Plato's Republic that the cave is an image of the world. And above that cave there is a band of all the signs of the zodiac. And beside the scene there is Chautes, the little character looking a bit like Mithras, holding a torch aloft with the flame blazing at the top, and Chautopates with his torch pointing downwards. And you have the sun in his chariot and the moon in her chariot above. You've never seen a picture that so screams at you, I mean something. And you've got to be a bit braver than perhaps scholars have traditionally been in order to decode this scene. The most promising approach, it seems to me, is to read it all as a star map. The individual animals are constellations. So the dog is Canis, Canis Major, the dog. Crater was the name of an ancient constellation. All of these are constellations. And what appears to be depicted is how the soul comes into the world and how it leaves the world. And those are the paths indicated by the torches of Chautes and Chautopates, pointing to the key zodiacal positions in the overhead ring. And there is one final crucial detail. It's been worked out that the sun appears to move, so that after a period of, I think it's 1800 years, it's something of that order, it rises against a different constellation at a given point in the year, like the spring equinox, to that which it previously rose against. And this phenomenon is known as the precession of the equinoxes. Now, the Romans and Greeks lived in the age of Aries, because that's where the sun rose. And we have moved now through the age of Aquarius. But before the age of Aries, it was the age of Taurus, the bull. And there is the theory that, in fact, what is being represented here is the management of time at the highest level. And Mithras killing the bull is ending a whole era of humanity and bringing in the new age. From our perspective, it looks very curious to have facts of astronomy and science, because they certainly are facts of astronomy and science, tied up with religion. You know, what were people doing worshipping the shape of time which could be scientifically established? But you see, from an ancient point of view, they don't see it that way. And they're much more matter of fact. And mystical people believed in souls, and indeed it was the common intellectual belief that souls existed. And they didn't think they were something beyond the physical universe, it's just they were lighter, more fiery than other things. So it was a real question, what happened to this soul substance when you died? And the only thing that could happen to it is that it would float upwards, provided it was light enough. Now, of course, if it hasn't practiced the virtuous life, it will not be light. But the place the soul will end up as first port of call as it rises is, of course, the moon. And the moon is the home of the dead. This idea that by looking at how time actually works, where the constellations actually are, how the heavenly bodies work, that you're doing science, no, it's all tied up with the life after death, because that's where life after death happens. Where does anybody think it happens today?
We can find no analogue for the Tauroctony in Christianity. So what did contemporaneous Christians make of this cult that was popular amongst the Roman elite?
The Christians write about the Mithras cult. They worry about the Mithras cult. They see in it features of their own cult. They see the communion, the holy meal. They see baptism. They see this particular devotion to a single God. And certainly from their perspective, Mithraism was a threat. And it's ironic that we don't have very much written evidence for Mithraism. We have plenty of monuments, but the written evidence is overwhelmingly Christian evidence. So in a way, they've preserved its memory, rather ironically.
I think the idea that Mithraism was ever a serious rival to Christianity, or that the absence of Christianity would have led to the flourishing of Mithraism, doesn't really work. In particular, the fundamental difference is the inward-looking, male-dominated nature of Mithraic cult. Christianity, part of what made Christianity spread was its involvement in the wider community. There were important roles for women, there was support for widows, for orphans, for poorer members of the community. So Christianity had an interest in outreach, in works that we don't find paralleled by Mithraism. So in that sense, the differences between them, I think, are more important in judging that they're not doing the same thing.
We are all aware of the circumstances of Christ's birth into the world and the religion that was formed around him. But how was this theology created? Is there a definite link with Mithraism?
The early Christians started very much in terms of a subsect of Judaism. So the Jewish tradition and the Jewish structures existed across the Roman Empire, with synagogues meeting in each of the cities. And most of the earliest Christian communities were breakaway movements from the synagogues that started to meet originally in the synagogues, but they were thrown out and therefore formed themselves into small groups in each of the cities. And over time, the hierarchy developed, but that took about 3 centuries.
Mithraism and Christianity were growing at the same time, and the sort of slot that was available for religion was of a certain shape in those years. And it's not surprising if some of the features are the same. Exclusive meetings, particular rituals, particular commemorations, a sense of progress in the religion, the quest for salvation, a wish to be specially in contact with the forces that make the universe work and give purpose to our lives. So there are many ways in which Mithraism is a similarly configured religion to Christianity. But Mithraism is a specialist religion, so that you sign up for Mithraism as well. Just as, how should we say, you can be a member of any profession, let us not say the police, and you can also be a Freemason. In the same way, you could worship the whole panoply of Greco-Roman gods and be a Mithraist. It was something extra as well. You know, it was buying a quality car in religion, if you like. Now, Christianity isn't like that, and never was. Christianity is about exclusive religion. And those Anglo-Saxon kings that thought that you could sort of sign up for Christianity and still keep your old idols in the shed at the back were mistaken. It had never been like that. You give yourself heart and soul to Christianity, and that is the end of it.
Mithraism was never presented as in conflict with the state religion of the Roman Empire, in as far as one can talk about that. In particular, one of the problems that Christianity faced was that it looked like the worship of an individual, Jesus, that was in conflict with worship of the emperor, and the imperial cult was an important element of religious activity throughout the empire.
Despite the mounting evidence that Mithraism was merely another pagan religion to the early Christians, the more controversial theories sometimes make their way into the mainstream media.
There are amazing things claimed about Mithras, and I'll read you some of them. He was a saviour, Mithras, sent to earth to live as a mortal, through whom it was possible for sinners to be reborn into immortal life. He died for our sins, but came back to life the following Sunday. He was born of a virgin on December the 25th in a manger or perhaps a cave, attended by shepherds, and became known as the light of the world. He had 12 disciples with whom he shared a last meal before dying. His devotees symbolically consumed the flesh and blood of him. Because Mithras was a sun god, he was worshipped on Sundays.
Is he a tribute band?
He's often depicted with a halo around his head. Oh. And Mithraists gave each other gifts on December the 25th. The leader of the religion was called a Papa, and HQ was on Vatican Hill in Rome.
And you're kind of writing off the chance that this is just a massive coincidence.
When you look at the things that are common, or apparently common, between the Mithraic traditions and the Christian traditions, I think the first thing to be clear is that it's very easy to identify 2 or 3 particular items, such as the date of the 25th of December, 24th, 25th, or the sacramental meal, if in Mithraism it's sacramental, which is a Christian idea, and then to ignore a whole series of things that are very different. But if we focus on the things that are the same, we can argue it is an influence from Mithraism to Christianity. We can argue it is an influence from Christianity to Mithraism. The two are developing in very much the same kind of world at much the same kind of time. But in both those cases, the 25th of December actually comes into Christianity quite late as a date, and it comes through from other Roman pagan practices, and may well have come into Mithraism from other pagan practices. They may have a common origin, as it were, rather than influencing each other. The meal is an interesting one. In Christianity, it eventually develops into bread and wine on a weekly basis, and I would argue around that. In Mithraism, some of the earliest Christian writers, Justin Martyr, for example, refers to it as a meal of bread and water. But again, wine is used in other contexts. Bread and wine would have been a normal meal in the early Roman Empire, or in the Roman Empire of the time. It's not something that in itself is necessarily distinct to those two groups. It is given significance by both of them in different ways. The other thing that I think is interesting about the relationship between the two is that they were both, by the time you get into the 2nd century, very influential within the Roman army and the military connection. And it's interesting to think where some of the connections and overlaps might have occurred within that military situation.
Birth of Mithras from a virgin being proposed? No, there is no real evidence. Images we have him coming out of the ground, born out of an egg, so that is not a parallel. 12 disciples, there are lots of different images of Mithras, very few of them show him with 12 people, but 12 is another major number, it's a number of months in the year. So the significance of the number 12 is pretty widespread. You find it in Judaism with the 12 tribes of Judea, which is where Christianity Jesus had 12 disciples because there were 12 tribes of Israel. And there are 12 tribes of Israel because there are 12 months in the year, arguably. And so that doesn't really hold up. And headquarters in Rome, Mithraism, as far as we know, didn't have a headquarters. Mithraic cult was just spread. There was no single major authority. So similarities between Mithraism and Christianity come down only to those elements which are so universal in the ancient world that they're not significant.
I think it's extremely unlikely that Christians knowingly and deliberately adopted the features of Mithraism in order to gain market share. We do know of things like that happened later, or vaguely like that, where you're told not to demolish a pagan temple, but in fact to use it for Christian purposes instead. Well, people have the habit of going there. Why break the habit of a lifetime? Just make them think right. But I think it's going too far to suppose that Mithras was either that important or that useful. That doesn't mean there weren't common practices, common themes and common ways of looking at the world, but I regard those as being more a feature of a common outlook in society, a sign of the times, rather than of people deliberately going and stealing each other's intellectual property.
As Christianity grew and solidified into an orthodoxy around the 2nd century AD, many of the pagan faiths, the Roman cults included, began to die away. That the early church practices initially overlapped with the numerous pagan ones is a more rational explanation than there being a secret and hidden origin of Christianity. That the cult of Mithras continues to be, for some, the true basis and hidden meaning of Christianity is perhaps the true mystery of Mithras.